Boa tarde a todos e, em particular, um agradecimento especial à Ministra Ana Brunhosa por estar connosco. Let me pass to English. This session will have two great speakers, Eric von Ippel from MIT and Bob Langer, also from MIT. And the two of them have collaborated over many, many years with Portugal and in particular with Portuguese researchers. Over the last years, Eric has been a major supporter and promoter of the initiative Helena Canhão and Pedro Oliveira launched, Patient Innovation, and he has certainly influenced not only them and the group of user innovators that have been showing to the world why we can promote innovation from patients, but also worldwide. He has been particularly dedicated to a better understanding of the ways we innovate and we can improve the relationships between society at large and those which produce knowledge. I have the opportunity to meet Eric many, many years ago at MIT and in many OECD contexts where Eric has always been a driver of a better understanding on the way people engage in a knowledge-driven society. But in the last 10 years, as I mentioned, Eric has been particularly important and relevant in promoting patient innovation with Helena and Pedro Oliveira, and for all the support he has given to researchers in Portugal. We have awarded him with the Portuguese Science Medal, and I'm very, very pleased to, again, acknowledge his contribution for the way we look at innovation in Portugal in the European context. Actually, Eric, you should be pleased to understand that last summer the European Commission has recognized Portugal as one of the European strong innovators country, and that is very, very much associated with the way SMEs at large and startups, and particularly academic-driven startups, has become so influential in our society. And again, lessons learned from the way we can open up the access to knowledge, and particularly using many of your understanding on the way we can and should understanding open innovation are particularly critical for our current positioning in Portugal, in Europe, and in the world at large. Eric's presentation will be followed by Bob Langer. Bob Langer has been associated with the MIT Portugal initiative since the very early stage, and he was in 2006 and 2007, one of the key persons with whom I could better understand how to open up the collaboration between Portuguese researchers and MIT. And again, in his lab, the largest world lab on biotechnology, has trained many, many Portuguese researchers over the last decades. Also, in the last years, Bob Langer has been particularly influential in supporting Pedro Oliveira and Helena in the Patient Innovation Initiative, and again, has continued to support the way Portuguese researchers try to promote innovation at large. As some of you may know, Bob has also been associated with many entrepreneurial initiatives, although a leading academic scholar. He is also a leading entrepreneur at the world level, and currently he is very much involved in one of the main companies associated with the vaccine for COVID, and I'm sure that you will report on the way biomaterials and bioengineering is driving change at the world level, but also to help fighting the pandemic that we all are facing. Earlier today, our Minister of Foreign Affairs was very clear demonstrating and discussing the relevance of the program with MIT and the way we look at the world and Portugal position foreign affairs through scientific collaboration. Our program Go Portugal, Global Science and Technology Partnerships Portugal, under which MIT Portugal initiative is one of the leading initiatives, has particularly been influential in the way we considered more and more transatlantic cooperation, and these two speakers are a part and a great part of those which has made possible MIT Portugal and Portugal at large to be nowadays recognized at the world level. So I thank you very much, these two speakers. We are particularly honored for the two of you to have accepted receiving the Portuguese Science Medal, and now it's time to listen to you and again to learn out of your lessons how can we always do better and better in the innovation context. At the end, the session will be closed by our Minister of Territorial Cohesion, in which I'm sure she will address the audience and all of those that are at home and at your institutions to better understand why science and innovation are also so important for territorial cohesion and the experience of Portugal in better understanding the role of science as a key strategic tool for a better inclusive society at large. Thank you very much.
Eric, you may want to share your slides.
Here we go. Okay. So let me say I'm enormously honored by this. I have indeed, through MIT and directly in Portugal, built a wonderful relationship, a research relationship, and I'm very aware of the very important contributions that Portugal is making and has made to our overall effort and to Portugal's unique sort of strength in the area of these new innovation methodologies. In my talk, I will discuss user innovation as an important general phenomenon, and also will discuss the major contributions being made by Portugal patient innovation scholars, specifically Professor Oliveira and Professor Kahano, as also mentioned by Minister Itur. So let me first begin with context, because I understand that our audience is quite a general one, and you know, that's always a wonderful thing. So let me first say that in economics, product users have traditionally been thought of as passive innovators. They're simply users of what the producers might give to them. So this was central. It was started out by Schumpeter in 1934, and it really is driving innovation practice and policy to these days. But it is wrong and it is incomplete, as we now, with work in Portugal and around the world, understand. So the model that that Schumpeter put forward and that has been driving things like patents and all these government policies to date is called the linear innovation model, and it is that a producer does market research, research and development, production, market diffusion. So for example, it would never occur within this kind of a situation that a user would see an innovation that the user needed for his or her or itself and would develop it for itself. It simply is not done. Instead, what happens, this theory, which is dominating the world today in terms of public policy and practice, is no, it is the producers who innovate, it is the users who have needs. So here, when I was a young man, my father was a professor at MIT as well, and I used to, ever since age 12, go around the corridors and I would see what scientists were doing in their various labs. And one of the things that I saw was that in fact, the scientists were the ones, the users of scientific instruments, were the ones who were developing their own instruments. It wasn't the Schumpeterian argument that a producer was coming and saying, aha, I see your need, Mr. Scientist, I will create a product for you. Instead, it was that the scientists developed what they need before there was a commercial product. This is an example, because this is a science medal. This is an example from scientific instruments. And what you see here is electron spectroscopy for chemical analysis, ESCA. As you can see from the image on the left, it's a pretty complicated device. It involves vacuums and electron beams and so on and so forth, and is complicated. It was developed by scientists who needed to study the surfaces of solids. It was not developed by companies saying, aha, I see you have a need. And what you can see from that chart there at the bottom is that the users developed and improved this innovation for years and years before finally a producer began to make it. This is very different than the situation that is commonly discussed, namely that the producer sees a need. It's extremely different, but it turns out to be very general. Now let me switch to, and by the way, you can see a reason here at the bottom. Basically, what's happening in the beginning is there's no market. For a really big innovation, there's no clear market. So producers have no incentive to enter, and users do, because individual scientists absolutely need this device to pursue their important research. So now, this is also true in medical areas. It's true, in fact, in general, in the consumer area. So suppose your child had a serious disease and medical firms were not offering what was urgently needed. What would you do? I'll bet you just wouldn't sit there and say, oh gosh, I hope someday a company comes and produces something to save my child. You, if you had the skills, would do something about it. And this is the general principle underlying the research of the patient innovation initiative of Pedro and Elena and others, and the general idea that it's users as well as producers who innovate. So I'm now going to give you an example of how this works. This example is what's called the artificial pancreas. And it is about something needed by people with type 1 diabetes. These people make 300 plus decisions a day that influence their blood glucose. They can make mistakes, and mistakes can be fatal. In fact, 5% of type 1 diabetics die by making a mistake over their lifetime. Typically, they make a mistake at night. They take too much glucose, and then they fall asleep, and they fall into a coma. Now, this happened to Dana. Dana Lewis, you see here on the left, and her husband, Scott Lebrand. Dana is a type 1 diabetic. And Dana made a miscalculation one night and went to sleep. She had, as usual, a juice box with sugar on her bedside table, because that's what type 1 diabetics do. If they make a miscalculation and they wake up in time, they can sip the juice from a juice box and save themselves. But Dana woke up too late. She could see the juice box, but she could not move her muscles to save herself. Luckily, Scott came in and saved her. Now, what is needed by these people, the reason the mistakes are made, is because there's so many complicated calculations that you have to make as a diabetic. You, for example, when you're having a meal, you have to estimate the carbs you're going to eat. You have to then correct for insulin resistance you may have, for your activities prior, like walking to the dinner, your activities post, like sitting still, and the amount of insulin you have on board, and then you must inject the correct insulin dose. No wonder lots of errors are made. Well, what could be done about this? Dana was afraid to go to sleep after this, as I would be as well. But Scott was a software engineer, and Scott said, this is ridiculous. We need to make an artificial calculation pancreas, a device basically that will calculate for Dana, using her rules, the amount of insulin she should take. What it does, in other words, currently we have a continuous blood glucose measuring device. Companies sell those. We also have insulin pumps. So in ordinary practice today, what you do is you look at your measurements on the blood glucose device, you do your manual calculations, and then you press the button on the insulin pump to give yourself insulin. What's missing is that box in red, namely something to automatically calculate the dosage. So what happened? Companies were saying, oh, wait 5 years, this is so hard, you can't expect us to do it right away. Dana and Scott built an artificial pancreas to automatically adjust insulin levels on Dana's insulin pump. Others helped. So in other words, they, in a few months, developed what companies said would take years. They developed it because they needed it. And what you see here is the first such device that was openly shared, artificial pancreas system design. In other words, what Dana and Scott did is they built this device, they used this device, they saw that their blood levels were improved. Here you see Dana's levels. She actually tracked her blood levels of glucose. The outcomes were better. She kept within range better than her manual calculations did. And then what did they do? They posted it on the web. So thousands of other people using these designs and updated ones are accumulating millions of safe, quote, flight hours with the same good results. Notice what this is. This is users solving their own needs when companies don't do it. Now, today, we have this thing continuously evolving, and it is, not many dollars, a couple of $100 versus what is now an available commercial device, which is $8,000. So many people still prefer the open APS, and they use it because it was inexpensive and because it's better. Now, recall again that in economics, product users have traditionally been viewed as passive. But now we see that's really not true. And what happened amongst my colleagues around the world is that we decided that we were going to measure for the first time the amount of innovation by consumers in the household sectors. So this would not count the scientists who also innovate, as we saw, for their own needs. This would count only consumers. This would count individual people living in their own homes, innovating for their own use. Now, when we first proposed to do this, it was quite astonishing from the perspective of the researchers, but we managed to do these standard surveys across 10 countries. And what you see is that it's about 6% of the population that innovates. This is a massive number of people. Across 10 countries, it's 65 million people. It is absolutely an amazing amount of people innovating. Consider the UK survey. 2 interesting general features are visible. It's big scale and it's free. That means, just like Dana and Scott, they create these innovations as householders. They don't sell them, they give them away. So first, you see here the percentage of population in England. It is 2.9 million people. That is 100 times more than all the people developing products for consumers. In other words, this massive effort has been invisible. Why has it been invisible? It has been invisible because, number one, the Schumpeterian argument said it shouldn't exist. And number two, since it's done for free, created at private cost in homes, and given away for free, there are no economic measures that were automatically generated to make it visible. There are no patents, and so on and so forth. And yet what we see here is that the annual consumer spending on R&D for products for themselves is $5.2 billion. That's 140% of what the companies are doing. So it's a huge phenomenon, and it's very important. The measures that we use, we calculate this very carefully. We just simply only accept things where users say, yes, they have created or modified something. It is not job related. In other words, they didn't do their work for IBM at home. It is not available on the market, and it is functionally novel. It improves things for the performance of whatever that user is trying to do. So the innovations we record are in fact very conservatively recorded. Now, what do we have? What we end up with then, and this is sort of the arena within which Pedro and I and Elena and others in Portugal and many around the world work, what you see is a brand new innovation paradigm. Basically, it's users self-rewarded, innovating and revealing for free, and then diffusing for free to others without protecting their innovations. Some of you may know about open source software, and you will see that pattern. People innovate for themselves, they just put it into a commons, and then they share it openly, other people improve it, and so on. You can see how enormously different it is than the innovation paradigm that has been traditional in the Schumpeterian world at the bottom. It is not about money, but it has enormous impacts, as we will see. Innovation designs that users make are often behind what producers are making. Why do they create innovations at their private cost and then give them away? It is because they are self-rewarded. This is a cluster analysis from Finland, and what you see here in these circles is the reasons that people give for why they innovated. You can see that users there, named after the biggest portion of the cluster, is personal need driven. That would be the case for the artificial pancreas that we just described. But there are also people innovating because they enjoy it. Those are participators. They learn from it. There are people helping others, like you would help your child. And finally, just 9% of the sample is producers. They are innovating to sell something. And so they are ones who make patents and so on. Now, again, because users are self-rewarded, they tend to pioneer. Why is this? You can see this curve. This is a standard market curve. It grows and then it declines over time. And at the very beginning of that curve, that's where you find these innovating users. It is not clear yet whether there's a market. And as a consequence, producers are not interested because they need a lot of product sales in order to, in fact, benefit from their innovations. Now, what happens then is that users pioneer, as in the case of the artificial pancreas. And therefore, it's very important to think about how those innovations get out to the general population. And here we come back to Pedro and Elena and the patient website that they have created, along with many colleagues as well. And this is why it's such a joy to work with them and the fundamental work that they are doing. How does this fit in? It looks from this like everything is under control, but in fact, there is a problem. The user innovation paradigm that we see in the top there involves people rewarding themselves. In other words, I develop an artificial pancreas to help my wife. I don't develop it to sell it. I am self-rewarded. Once I have helped my wife, then I have gotten my reward. I have no incentive to diffuse it further. This is a problem because, in fact, as you see in the bottom arrow, diffusion is driven by producers relentlessly. Producers are not self-rewarded. They only get benefit when they sell something to somebody else. So they will work really hard to diffuse their innovations. On the other hand, user innovators who solve their own problems are not motivated so strongly in this direction. So we see this in the data. What we can see, this is a study again in Finland of diffusion effort. What we see is that innovations that are very valuable to many, that's the one in the red circle, only 23% of the innovators make any effort at all to inform either their peers or to inform producers. Now that is the problem that Pedro and Elena and their center are working upon. And it's a central problem to this newly emerging innovation world that we see. Basically, what you have is innovations that their patient innovation site collects. So they, the user again has no particular incentive to diffuse it. The center that Pedro and Elena built is in fact going out proactively and getting these innovations, because one of the forms of diffusion is to bring them to a point where others can see them. Then what they do is they explore the pattern by which these innovations do or can diffuse. Here are two examples from their site. You see an insulin port there. Again, it's for diabetes, and what it is sort of this little sort of device that you put under your skin. You adhere it to your skin so that when you make an injection, you don't always have to puncture yourself again and again as a diabetic. Instead, you sort of inject the insulin dose you want within this sort of plastic port. Now, developed by a patient who did not want to repeatedly stick herself, and acquired by Medtronics. Medtronics then, an existing firm, became the method to diffuse that important patient innovation. Another example is another method. This is the shower shirt. Here is a patient startup. What this amounts to is a woman had a mastectomy and was told by her doctors when she said, well, I want to shower, what should I do to protect the incisions and so on? And they said, well, just make a hole in a garbage bag and put it over your head. This was ridiculous from this person's perspective. And so what she did was make a shower shirt for herself. You can see there in the middle of that second row, what she did was she created sort of pockets in it so that she could put her drains and so on into safe locations while she took a shower. And she started a company. Well, that is excellent. But those self-done, self-achieved diffusions are relatively rare. There's an enormous amount more of very important innovations out there that have to be somehow diffused more effectively. And this kind of research that the Patient Innovation Group is doing, conducting research on all diffusion options, providing practical support and teaching, it's a wonderful phenomenon, and Portugal is the leader due to your wonderful academic colleagues here. Now, free innovation, this kind of innovation I'm talking about, is getting bigger and bigger, so that what Pedro and Elena and many of us around the world are doing is getting to be more and more important. Producer innovation is getting outshadowed increasingly by this kind of innovation that I showed you, whether it's the scientific instrument being developed by scientists, or the medical innovations being developed by medical people, or in every other field, innovations being done by users for themselves. So what you see is that design costs are dropping due to computerization. Communication costs are dropping due to the internet. So what we now can have is large-scale projects like Linux that can outdo the kinds of projects that producers come up with. And you see then that the producer, if you think of it as design costs are dropping and communication costs are dropping due to the internet, basically all innovation opportunities are moving downward to the left into areas where these collaborative user innovation activities can occur. So we now, with help of Portugal and other countries, we now have managed to make the definition of innovation, have changed it to include both patient and free and open innovation. Previously, it was outside of the OECD official definition. All of us working together have now made it part of the definition. So we are moving this kind of activity from the research sphere to policy and practice. And I'm hugely happy to be participating in this activity along with my colleagues in Portugal. Thank you very much.
Eric, thank you very much again for the way you explain to everyone how innovation works, and certainly the way you are also supporting researchers from Portugal. And the lessons are always also the way we are open to collaboration with you and get your lessons to make sure that our population at large can also be innovators. And I believe that the lessons is that the access to innovation is open to everyone. And certainly it requires a training population able to be confident on provide solutions that can definitely be used by others. On the other side of the way knowledge and science and our own mobilization can be used to change our lives is what we will listen by Bob Langer. As I mentioned before, Bob has become particularly engaged with many Portuguese researchers over the last years. He was very, very much instrumental in the launching of MIT Portugal joint ventures in 2006 and 2007. And since then, he has very much engaged in training and supporting Portuguese researchers and Portuguese entrepreneurs. Bob, as you may know, has become a leading academic scholar, also the American West Medal of Technology, and we have also awarded this year the Portuguese Science Medal to Bob. He has also engaged in many leading entrepreneurial projects, and himself is engaged in several companies. One of them is Modena, one of the leading companies associated with the attempts to develop a vaccine to prevent and to avoid the propagation of COVID-19. Many scholars in Portugal has been interact with Bob Langer over the last years, but he has also been particularly instrumental in supporting patient innovation and the work Helena Canhão and Pedro Oliveira are promoting at a world level, but which was launched through a Portuguese-funded project some 12 years ago. So again, Bob, thank you very much for supporting all the Portuguese researchers over the last years, and in particular Pedro and Helena, and very much for accepting also the Portuguese Science Medal, and we all are listening to you and to your future developments in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very. Can people hear me okay? So anyhow, it's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you. So I thought I'd start and tell you about how, what we've tried to do in terms of innovation. And my background's very different. You know, I'm a chemical engineer. And in 1974, when I graduated, all my friends went into the oil industry. So I thought I should do that too. But as I started interviewing with them, I wasn't that excited about what they were doing. And I was looking for a way that I could use my background in engineering and chemistry to help people. And I ended up taking a job at Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School with a man named Judah Folkman. And I was the only actually engineer in the entire hospital. And by the way, it didn't pay nearly as much as the oil companies, but I was very excited about it because he had an idea, which is shown on the next slide. If we could advance the slide. And his idea was that if you could stop blood vessels from growing to tumors, maybe that would be a way to treat cancer and other diseases. And this slide, this goes back to 1971, actually. What happened, his theory, he had a theory that if you had a tumor cell, it started to grow in 3 dimensions. And if you look in the middle lower part of the screen, what you see is it sort of plateaued. You get about 1 million cells, it turns out, and it wouldn't get any bigger than that because it runs into a nutrition problem. Cells in the center die because they can't get nutrients or get rid of waste. But his theory was that the tumor made something called TAF, tumor angiogenesis factor, that caused the surrounding capillaries, which normally didn't do anything, didn't grow, to now grow directionally right to the tumor. And what that did is it solved the nutrition problem because that could bring in nutrients and so forth. And then as you see in the upper right-hand part of this picture, the tumor would get bigger and bigger. And on the highest part, you see it's very vascularized. And so the tumor is not only big, but it can spread through those blood vessels. That's a process called metastasis, and that could eventually kill. So this turned out to be an incredibly controversial theory. I thought it was great because I didn't know any biology, but most clinicians and biologists thought it was crazy. But anyhow, I was thrilled, and my job was to prove it. And in so doing, could we isolate substances that could stop blood vessels? So how do you think about a problem like that? Well, first we had to find something that could stop blood vessels. And what I began studying was cartilage. Next slide. I'd get bones from a slaughterhouse, and then I found out where all the bones went, and they went to these meatpacking places in South Boston. And I'd get them, I'd bring hundreds or thousands back, and I'd scrape the meat off them, and they'd look like you see here. And then the upper part is cartilage. And I'd slice those off, pieces off, and I'd extract them with certain solvents and then try to purify them, and I'd get different fractions. But that brings up the next question, which is how do you test this? And if you look back at the history of biology and medicine, a lot of times people find factors. And what's really been key is having a way to have what's called a bioassay, a way to study what those factors are doing. And there wasn't one for this field, so we had to invent it. And the next slide shows what we tried to do. It turns out if you put certain tumors in the eye, like a V2 carcinoma, it will cause blood vessels to grow in the cornea. It takes about 9 or 10 weeks. So what we had to do was, and you could actually measure those blood vessels with an ophthalmic microscope. So we were going to use rabbits. And what we wanted to do was be able to take any of the things in cartilage, all of which were big molecules, like peptides and proteins and so forth, and be able to put them in what we call a slow release polymer that could deliver them for this 9-week or more period. And so we asked I didn't know anything about polymers. So we asked different people if they could help us who were really expert in the field. But everyone came back with the same answer that's shown in the next slide, that the big molecules can't get through polymers any more than any of us could walk through a brick wall. The literature, by the way, said the same. Next slide. And the only thing that I had maybe going for me is I hadn't read any of this. So I didn't know any better. So I tried anyhow. Nonetheless, I experimented for 2 years. I found over 200 different ways to get this to not work. But eventually, next slide, I was able to make little microspheres or nanospheres. This is a picture of one on the left and one cut in half on the right. And we published in Nature, next slide, the fact that you could use these to release molecules of any size. And in fact, we also in this same paper, this turns out to be the very first time that nucleic acids like RNA or DNA were encapsulated in materials, little nanospheres or microspheres. And as I'll talk about a little later, that ends up becoming key to what Moderna and other companies are doing. So anyhow, we showed that you could do all this. We even showed, next slide, if you wanted to, that you could get constant release. But when I first started presenting this at scientific meetings, it was really ridiculed. I remember in 1976 giving a lecture at a big chemistry meeting, and I talked about this. I was 27 years old, and when I got done with the talk, a whole bunch of scientists came up to me and they said, "We don't believe anything you just said." They said, next slide, that these large molecules can't diffuse through materials. And we were also using organic solvents. They said that would destroy anything you put in. So, and actually things went downhill from there. First, I tried to get grants from the government, but they have these review panels and they all kept saying, well, Dr. Langer doesn't know anything about biology or medicine, so he shouldn't get these grants. And so my first 9 were rejected very badly. Also, I loved being a postdoc at Children's Hospital, but a lot of my friends told me that it's probably not a good idea to do that forever. So I started applying for faculty positions after 3 years. But what happened was, I'm a chemical engineer, so I applied to these faculty positions in chemical engineering, but every single one rejected me. They said the same thing as the grants. They said, well, a chemical engineer does oil, it doesn't do anything in biology. So I didn't get any chemical engineering jobs. And in fact, I was fortunate, I did get a job in a nutrition department. And the reason I got that was because the department head there, Nevin Scrimshaw, he was what I'd call like a benevolent dictator. So he liked me, so he offered me a job, but he didn't bother to ask anybody else what they thought. And that probably still would have been okay, except for one thing, which was the year after I joined, he left. So a lot of the faculty decided to give me advice, and they said I should leave too. In fact, the next slide is from Michael Marletta, who was a very good friend of mine. He was in that department at that same time I was, in the 70s and early 80s. And he was giving a speech on me a couple of years ago and talking about that. And I'll just read it. He said one evening he went to a dinner at a Chinese restaurant with me and some senior MIT professors. He said a senior scientist sat quizzing us while smoking a cigar. When the older scientist heard my concepts for drug delivery, he blew a cloud of smoke in my face and said, "You better start looking for another job." And Mike said thought he was in a Fellini movie. Well, I didn't have much choice. They didn't want me, but I was there and I hoped that I could stay, and I kept doing my research. And one of the things we began studying was, since nobody believed this could work, was how did it work? So we started taking thin sections through these materials and visualizing them with what's called a cryomicrotome and then various microscopes. And the next slide shows a picture of one of those materials, ethylene vinyl acetate copolymer, as a model system. And it turns out that if something was even 200 molecular weight or greater, it couldn't go from one side to the other. Then how could these molecules get out? Well, it turns out, next slide, that if you put a model molecule in, like say myoglobin, which is red, and you cut a thin section before any release, you get what we call as a phase separation. So the polymer is white and the drug in this case is red. And if you release this for a year in this particular example, what you see is on the next slide. Left behind are where the drug was, are these pores. And these pores are large enough so that molecules of any size can get through. But it turns out that the pores, the way we made these, are very winding and tortuous. So it takes a very long time for the molecules to get through. If any of you have ever been to Boston, my hometown, I sometimes say it's like driving a car through Boston. And over the years, our students have figured out ways to design these so you can get release anywhere from a day to many years. But because we could do this, we could now go back and try to solve the angiogenesis problem. The next slide shows the assay. And what we did, I actually had something like 100 different samples that I wanted to test. And we did like an N of 20 for each of these. And almost every one didn't work. I think of those as the controls. But one did, and the next slide's kind of graphic, but there's no better way to show it. And these are the rabbit eye assays. This is from a paper we wrote in Science in 1976. And if you look on the left, what you see, this is after 9 weeks, is the sheet of blood vessels growing over the polymer to the tumor. And this happens 100% of the time. But, and in fact, if you looked at this eye 3 weeks later, if you did that experiment, it would be three-dimensional, out of the orbit of the eye, it would actually kill. We sacrificed the animals before that. But on the right-hand side, what was striking, and we saw this, if we could go back, we saw this every time, is that when you put this inhibitor in, the vessels are lower, they're sparser, they avoid the polymer, and over 60% of the time, these tumors never grew. So this was the first time that you could actually show that substances could stop blood vessels. And also it gave assays, bioassays that people could use in the future to study this. Nonetheless, it took another 28 years from this paper before the first blood vessel inhibitor was approved. And that's because companies like Genentech had great scientists, but spent billions of dollars developing these. But what happened starting in 2004 was striking. And that's shown on the next slide, which is that one after the next inhibitor is approved by FDA. Starting in 2004, Avastin, the first one, is probably the #2 best-selling biotech drug in history. But beyond that, they're not only used for cancer. Before this, there were no treatments for eye diseases like macular degeneration or diabetic retinopathy using molecules. This was the first time that happened too. And those drugs like Lucentis and Eylea have also become very, very widely used for preventing and in some cases even reversing those diseases. Well, we also felt, Dr. Folkman and I, that beyond angiogenesis, perhaps these drug delivery systems could be useful for other things. So Larry Brown, one of my students, did it for his thesis that showed that you could deliver like a molecule like insulin with a single injection for over 100 days. And that's shown on the next slide. And then one day, Dr. Folkman said to me, Bob, we should file a patent. And that might seem common today, but then in the 70s, Boston Children's Hospital, where I was, never had a patent. So we filed a patent for the very first time in the hospital's history. And 5 years in a row, the patent examiner rejected it. He said, didn't make any sense to him. And then the people at the hospital started telling me, Bob, you should just forget it. He's never going to allow it. But I don't like to forget it. And I started to think, how could we convince the patent examiner to allow this? Legally, of course. And science really wasn't working. So as I told you in the beginning, when I first started doing this, everyone told me it was impossible, it couldn't work. And I wondered, did anybody ever write that down? So you can do what's called a science citation search, meaning I could, and I did this in 1982, after 5 years of getting rejected, and I could go back in 1982 and look at who referenced our 1976 Nature paper and what did they say. And I found things that I never realized even existed. And the next slide shows a great example of that. Here's a review article, it turns out, that had been written in 1979 by 5 of the top chemists in the world. And what they wrote, they're describing this field. And I was sort of shocked when I saw it. I'll just read it to you. They said, generally, the agent to be released is a relatively small molecule with a molecular weight no larger than a few hundred. One would not expect that macromolecules, for example, proteins, could be released by such a technique because of their extremely small permeation rates through polymers. However, Folkman and myself have reported some surprising, so surprising is a great word for a patent examiner, some surprising results that clearly demonstrate the opposite. So I showed that to the people at the hospital. They flew down to Washington, showed it to the examiner, and he said, gee, I had no idea. I will allow this patent if Dr. Langer can get written affidavits, written documents from each of these 5 people that they really wrote that. So I was this young professor. I wrote all these well-known people, and they're all actually nice enough to write me back that they really did write it. And then we got this very broad patent. Next slide. And with that patent, I got involved in starting companies. The hospital licensed it to companies. We teach different companies how to do this. And what that's led to, next slide, are all kinds of products, from microspheres and you need the delivery systems, otherwise the drugs are destroyed right away. So there's treatments here for prostate cancer, preventing bleeding, opioid addiction, type 2 diabetes, different eye diseases, pains and medications, schizophrenia, and so forth. Not only could you do this, it turns out that, as I mentioned to you, that that if you could, we could not only make microparticles and so forth, but you could also make nanoparticles. And I thought what I'd do is show you a video of Nova, the TV show. They came and filmed something in our lab, and they did a much better job than anything I can do. So I thought I would show you the video. I want to make sure the sound is on, but if we could show the video of the nanoparticles that we did. Is the sound on?
Encased in a plastic that releases the drug over time. That in turn gets a special wrapping that disguises the package as a water molecule to fool the body's immune system. And last but not least, the address where it should be delivered, a key that will only fit the lock of cancer cells.
A lot of the clinicians I work with tell me it doesn't really blow up the cell like that, but you get the idea. And these are in various, if we could stay there for a second. And these are used in various types of cancer treatments, but maybe even more exciting is that it's been absolutely crucial to RNA therapies. So Alnylam, a company I've been involved with from the beginning, has used nanoparticles to deliver siRNA to the liver, and they actually got approval from regulatory authorities to treat ATTR amyloidosis, which is a rare disease. And as was mentioned in my introduction about me, is we started Moderna, which is a company that develops messenger RNA drugs. They actually have 14 in clinical trials, one of which is the COVID vaccine. And actually, it's not just Moderna that's using nanoparticles to deliver messenger RNA. Every company that's developing a COVID vaccine, Pfizer, BioNTech, all of them are using nanoparticles to do this, because otherwise the RNA would be destroyed. So that's been very exciting, and I have my fingers crossed that it will hopefully help a lot of people. The second thing that I want to go over, since I was working on materials, I was curious, how did materials find their way into medicine? So I was looking into this one day at the hospital, and the next slide shows how it was almost always done. Next slide. And pretty much what was always the driving force for getting materials into medicine was a medical doctor going to their house to find an object that kind of resembled the organ or tissue they wanted to fix. And then they'd use something from their house. So it turns out, like, the artificial heart is a lady's girdle material because it has a good flex life like a heart. And a breast implant, one is a mattress stuffing because it's squishy. And that was pretty much all that was done in the 20th century. But I thought we could take more of a chemical engineering approach and ask the question, what do we really want in a biomaterial from an engineering, chemistry, and biology standpoint, and then create it from scratch. The next slide shows an example of what we tried to do. I was very interested, and we still do a tremendous amount of work in our lab on biodegradable polymers. But almost all of these degradable polymers degrade like this. They display bulk erosion, and that could lead to bursts of drug coming out, which for an anti-cancer drug or insulin could be fatal. So we said, from an engineering standpoint, what would you really like? And what we said is on the next slide, surface erosion. So we went to the blackboard. I had some very good chemists and toxicologists helping me, and we wrote different structures. And the next slide shows one of them that we thought would be very good. It's what's called a copolymer. And as you change the ratio of those two units, the CPP and the sebacic acid, you can get different erosion or release rates. And the next slide shows that depending on what you put, what the ratio is, you can get almost any release rate you want, from literally a day to weeks or even years. And since we did that, one of my friends, Henry Brem, he's now chief of neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins, came to see me and he said, well, Bob, could we come up with a better way to treat glioblastoma multiforme? And the next slide shows a little bit of, this was the 1980s, of what we were talking about. Normally, the lifespan for these patients, no matter what you do, is less than a year. But the drug they used at that time was shown on the next slide, BCNU. And it's terribly toxic, and you give it, it spreads throughout the whole body. So the idea we came up with was, next slide, could we allow the neurosurgeon like Dr. Brem to operate on the patient, open up the brain, because they're going to do that anyhow, to take the tumor out as much as possible. But before he closes it up, could he line the surgical cavity with little wafers? Now, normally this drug has a 12-minute lifetime, but here with the polymer, it protects the BCNU from degradation. So you get high concentrations in the brain where you want it, and low concentrations where the rest of the body, where it could cause harm. Now, of course, if you're a professor in the US, you have to raise money. And so I would write grants on this and to try to get money from the National Institutes of Health, and I always did terrible. The next slide shows some of the reviews. So first, when we wrote this, the reviewer said the polymers couldn't be synthesized, but I had a terrific graduate student, Howie Rosen, who synthesized them. And then people said, well, okay, but then the polymers will react with whatever you put in because you have these anhydride bonds. But I had another great postdoc, Cam Leung, and he showed that didn't happen. Then people said, well, okay, but in 1985, they said the polymers are fragile. They'll break because they're low molecular weight. But I had another couple of postdocs, Edith Mathiowicz and Avi Dome. Edith is a full professor at Brown now, and Avi is dean of pharmacy in Hebrew University, and they made polymers that were high molecular weight and very strong. And then people said, well, okay, but new materials are going to be toxic. But Cato Lorenzen, one of my graduate students who won the National Medal of Technology from President Obama, showed that wasn't the case. And then people said, well, okay, but even so, the drug won't diffuse far enough to kill the tumor. But Mark Saltzman, who was my graduate student and actually headed up Yale University's first biomedical engineering department, showed that they did. Anyhow, this kept going on until 1996 when the FDA approved it. By the way, if people are wondering how we got funding, we did have patents and we got some corporate money. But at any rate, the FDA approved it in 1996. It was the first time in over 20 years the FDA approved a new brain cancer treatment, and the first time ever they approved this idea of local chemotherapy. Just to show you a little bit about how this looks, the next slide shows a picture. I'm going to go fast because I don't want you to have to look too long at these. Next slide. Usually they put 6 or 7 in and close up the brain. The next slide shows you some of the earliest clinical data, and it's not a cure by any means. It basically can prolong life and relieve suffering, but and you certainly see that on the second graph, the 2-year graph. In fact, a couple of years ago, next slide, they did an analysis of all the patients on over 60 trials. And what you see again is that you do get a significant survival. In fact, this has now been this treatment's now been approved and used the last 24 years. It's been used in over 20 countries. And maybe not only is the fact that it can help in cancer, but also where it's helped even more based on some of our patents is in heart disease. And if somebody has heart disease, one of the main ways of treating heart disease is to put in a stent. Next slide. It's kind of like a Chinese finger puzzle. And but when you put these in, it can cause proliferation, a problem called restenosis. So what people now do is they take a different anti-cancer drug, Taxol, put it on a polymer and coat it on the stent. And these are used by millions of patients every year to keep blood vessels open. Well, the very last thing I want to talk about is, can we make new tissues or organs? In other words, not only can you deliver drugs, but could you deliver cells? And so this was motivated by work I did with Jay Vacanti. And here's a little baby on the next slide that's dying of liver failure. And the only way a child like that could live is somebody else would die. And Jay once asked me, could we come up with a different paradigm? And what we did is shown on the next slide. This is from a paper we wrote in Science. And our idea is that we could take almost any cell type. We actually wrote this before people talked about stem cells. But you could take any cell type, and if you injected at random, not much would happen. But turns out cells are smart. And if you put cells on a scaffold, they could actually reform structures. People had shown this before we did in basic work, like out at Berkeley. And then you have to grow it in vitro, like in a bioreactor, and you could make literally any tissue. And we use different materials. The next slide shows some of the ones that we would use. Either polylactic glycolic acid, which is FDA approved. We also synthesize brand new materials like polylactic acid colysine. And if you look at that amine group at the bottom, you can link in by covalently different amino acid structures, which can help certain cells stick. So we actually had a whole library of different materials. And then you'd make them into fibers like you see on the next slide. Or you could even make any structure by what are called CAD-CAM techniques. Prasad Shastri had done some of this. And let's say you want to make a nose. So the next slide's an example of that. You could use computer-aided design to make a nose. And you see that it's pictures of these. It's like 98% porous. And then you could design it by CAD/CAM, by computer-aided design, and then do something like foaming techniques or three-dimensional printing, and you could make the nose, and then you could take somebody's own cells, like from an ear, and make a tissue. And actually, to that end, some of the people in our lab and the Vacanti brothers, they've actually made tissue. The next slide is a picture of a nude mouse, and where on the bottom part, you can see we've redone this guy's skull. And on the next slide, we've redone this, on the top left, we've redone this guy's cheek. And if you open up the animal and look at the tissue, it's pure white glistening cartilage. You see that on the next slide. And histologically, it's cartilage as well. The only thing is it's good cosmetically, but it's not strong enough if some of you are runners. And so we're still working on that. But what happened was the Army in the United States approached Jay, myself, and Linda Griffith, one of my former postdocs, and they said, we have people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, soldiers, without ears and without other body parts. Could you make those? So the next slide is a human ear that Linda made on the top part. And on the bottom right, you see a scanning electron micrograph of polymer fibers that will degrade actually into water and carbon dioxide. But before they do, you put cells on them, and the cells actually grow and they make matrix. And you can actually make an ear. This is shown on the next slide on a rabbit. Next slide. And the reason we do that is we want to show that these are safe for people. So, this has actually now been done on different patients. Here's a little boy who's 12 years old at the time, but he likes to play baseball. But if he were ever hit on the chest with a baseball, he could die. So Jay operated on him. We made a polymer scaffold for him. Jay took his cells and made a chest for him. And he's now doing fine at 6 feet tall as a chest. Other companies have licensed our technology to make new skin, which is actually FDA approved for people who are burned or have skin ulcers. And I'll show that now on the next slide. So this is a little boy who's baby, 2 years old, very badly burned. But the product now is neonatal skin fibroblasts on a scaffold. Next slide. You can put it in the child at the time of injury. Next slide. And so this is time 0, but let's come back 3 weeks later. Next slide. And on the last slide, let's come back 6 months later. Next slide. Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah, well, we'll stay there. I guess the last slide didn't come out. But basically, he's basically completely healed after 6 months, which is what I was going to show. Now, people are taking this in all different directions. You know, companies and scientists, you know, people are using tissue engineering now to make new spinal cords, to make new blood vessels, to make new corneas. And again, a lot of these are in clinical trials. And it's been taken in lots of other directions too. One of the concerns that people have is like animal testing and human testing. So now what we see is using these kinds of approaches, people having organs and tissues on a chip, which can minimize, I hope, animal and human testing. And people are even doing things that never even occurred to me when we first did this. Like some people, some of my former students even, and others are using this to make meat, you know, from scratch, to make leather and so forth. So this is basically what I wanted to tell you about some of the work we've done. I'm really deeply honored that you asked me to speak, and very honored about you giving me such a wonderful award. I want to wish you all the best, and thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you very much again, Bob. Nós voltamos para o português e eu cumpro-me apresentar a ministra Ana Abrunhosa, que tem, de uma forma incessante, apoiado o desenvolvimento da ciência para a coesão territorial e tentar que as regiões portuguesas também tenham mais ciência de uma forma aberta, e ela, melhor do que ninguém, pode nos dizer como é que percebemos também o desenvolvimento da ciência para o futuro e, sobretudo, numa altura onde estamos a desenhar os futuros fundos comunitários, quer ao nível do plano de recuperação e resiliência, quer, sobretudo, também no plano de financiamento, no programa de financiamento plurianual, aquilo que será o Portugal 2030, perceber como articular os fundos nacionais e os fundos de gestão centralizada europeus para melhor avançarmos neste campo de batalha que aqui foi tão bem demonstrado por estes dois cientistas e investigadores norte-americanos que trabalham com Portugal há muitos anos e que, sobretudo, nos têm apoiado neste percurso de fazermos sempre mais e melhor. Ana, muito obrigado.
Muito boa tarde, queria agradecer ao Sr. Ministro o convite e é um grande prazer estar aqui hoje, partilhar um bocadinho do que são a nossa experiência no apoio à ciência, mas sobretudo uma ciência que se quer mais digital, mais resiliente, mais verde, mais social e de que modo todas estas dimensões contribuem para digamos, uma coesão territorial e, portanto, aqui incluir também, eu estive ali a enumerar todos aqueles conceitos e eu vou acrescentar o mais local, mais territorial e, portanto, a importância de todas estas facetas da ciência para a competitividade territorial e, portanto, para os territórios e darei aqui alguma nota do que são também os nossos desafios nos territórios do interior. Quero fazer aqui primeiro uma nota muito importante. Vou focar-me sobretudo no papel da ciência, uma ciência muito ao serviço dos problemas da economia e muito em parceria com a comunidade. Isto não significa que nós não também a financiemos e que também não sejamos totalmente favoráveis a apoiar a investigação livre, sem utilidade imediata e, portanto, deixo essa premissa da importância de também financiarmos essa ciência que se faz sem fronteiras, de forma como sabem muito melhor do que eu. Eu tenho aqui algumas notas que vou seguir mais por uma questão de raciocínio e o que eu vos queria transmitir é que da experiência que temos, esta ideia de desencontro entre ciência e comunidade hoje é muitas das vezes uma ideia errada, cada vez mais errada. Eu devo dizer que nos últimos 5 anos esta questão de a ciência e aqueles que trabalham a ciência estarem cada vez mais próximo das comunidades envolventes é uma realidade, Não é uma realidade por necessidade, é uma realidade porque, de facto, os tempos assim o vêm exigindo. Estes períodos se há momento em que o cidadão normal, o cidadão que muito provavelmente nunca refletiu sobre a importância da ciência e a confiança que muitos de nós temos, basta ouvir basta pensar no que os 2 últimos oradores nos transmitiram. A confiança cega que muitos de nós temos na ciência para resolver os nossos problemas e as nossas dúvidas, muitas vezes existenciais, mas isso muitas das vezes está reservado para uma fração demasiado pequena da população. A pandemia trouxe ao cidadão comum a importância da ciência para resolver os seus problemas do dia-a-dia. Isto é muito importante. Eu às vezes digo isto num contexto mais político, mas penso que vão entender. O dia em que o cidadão comum entender que nós não resolvemos os nossos problemas, pelo menos de forma sustentável, de forma resiliente, sem ciência, o dia em que o cidadão comum entender isto vai, peço desculpa pela linguagem, vai dar votos e vai ser muito mais fácil para nós políticos canalizarmos verbas do orçamento para a ciência. Isto é tão simples quanto isto. A valorização que o cidadão comum dá ao trabalho que os cientistas fazem. E a pandemia pôs isto na discussão do dia-a-dia dos cidadãos, no café, na mesa do café, nas redes sociais. Isto é muito importante. Eu nunca falarei de uma oportunidade, porque esta pandemia não é uma oportunidade, falarei de uma lição que temos que reter e que temos que aproveitar. E, portanto, deixava esta primeira nota. E a importância que as sociedades têm que dar ao talento. Em primeiro lugar, a questão do talento, porque só o talento é que produz conhecimento ligado à ciência e à tecnologia. E, portanto, esta ideia, aquelas frases feitas de que o conhecimento é o grande motor da economia, eu penso que hoje o cidadão comum entende isto verdadeiramente e, portanto, esta verdade não está circunscrita a uma franja da população. Hoje ela está na consciência de todos os portugueses. Isso é, de facto, muito importante. O que é que tem contribuído para isto? O facto de termos um sistema científico e tecnológico muito mais consolidado, com uma distribuição territorial muito equilibrada, é uma das características do nosso país. O facto de termos as instituições de ensino, os centros tecnológicos, os centros de valorização do conhecimento, os centros de interface distribuídos no nosso território e próximo das economias locais, criou-se uma massa crítica que permite passar conhecimento para as empresas e, neste momento, nós já verificamos que são as empresas que vão ter com os centros de investigação, com os politécnicos, com os centros tecnológicos, para juntos desenvolverem e co-criarem novos produtos e serviços com os quais as empresas vão competir internacionalmente, em todos os setores. Isto é muito importante porque só depois deste contacto é que muitas das vezes as empresas se apercebem que têm que ter talentos nas suas organizações para absorver este conhecimento e para o endogeneizar nas suas organizações. E só a partir daqui é que as empresas, e quando falo das empresas, falo das organizações, passam a desenvolver atividades económicas de elevado valor. E só isso é que lhes permite contratar pessoas qualificadas e pagar salários elevados, porque é isso que permite reter os nossos talentos, ou seja, a valorização do conhecimento que têm e a possibilidade de, nas nossas empresas, desenvolverem atividades que aproveitem esse conhecimento. E, portanto, cada vez mais esta consciência de que o conhecimento é fator crítico para resolvermos os problemas das nossas sociedades. Nós, as nossas empresas, muito tradicionalmente, resolvíamos os problemas de forma empírica e hoje há esta concepção de que temos que ir mais além, de temos que pedir ajuda. Até porque isso é fundamental, estas parcerias, porque muitas das empresas não têm internamente estes recursos e ao fazer estas parcerias elas ganham dimensão porque incorporam competências que não têm internamente e que resultam destas parcerias. Queria aqui também sinalizar que o investimento em ciência e tecnologia por parte das organizações aumentou cerca de 60%. E isso deveu-se em grande parte não só ao grande dinamismo do nosso Ministro, do seu Secretário de Estado, pessoas extraordinárias, mas ao apoio dos fundos europeus que têm permitido criar estas sinergias com a atividade empresarial. E aqui, quando falo de fundos europeus, Falo não só daqueles que gerimos no nosso país, mas falo também da importância das nossas instituições e das nossas empresas concorrerem às iniciativas geridas diretamente pela Comissão Europeia, porque isso tem outra vantagem para nós, é que nos insere em redes internacionais e, portanto, posiciona-nos e cria novas oportunidades, quer no ensino, quer na investigação, quer na inovação. E, portanto, é fundamental, esta questão da globalização, é fundamental a expansão da área geográfica da nossa influência e é fundamental que cada vez mais assumamos lideranças em redes internacionais. E isso tem acontecido, isso depois é muito bom para a experiência que trazemos para o nosso país. Os centros de conhecimento, qual é a vantagem que muitas das vezes, ou que sempre em geral vemos nestas parcerias entre as empresas e os centros de conhecimento e o facto de os projetos inovadores, mesmo feitos em parceria com as empresas, a vantagem que têm de ser feitos nos centros tecnológicos, nos centros de conhecimento, é que os centros de conhecimento têm condições de liberdade e trabalham fora do ambiente de negócio para desenvolverem o conhecimento e as tecnologias e soluções inovadoras. Isso é muito importante, que estes projetos inovadores sejam feitos fora do ambiente de negócio normal e ainda num ambiente que depois permite o teste e o ensaio, que depois podem ser entregues de forma muito mais amadurecida às empresas. Isto verificou-se, por exemplo, com o ventilador, neste contexto de pandemia e com outras iniciativas que a academia e que as entidades do sistema científico e tecnológico tiveram. Faça um mercado cada vez mais competitivo, não tenhamos dúvidas e nunca é demais sublinhá-lo e enquanto comunidade nós estamos cada vez mais conscientes disso, que é o conhecimento que permite às empresas anteciparem tendências de mercado e estarem à frente do mercado. Hoje já não basta seguir o mercado e aqui basicamente nós tivemos um bocadinho esta mensagem, as empresas, seja qual for a área, têm que antecipar, têm que estar à frente do mercado e só é possível fazê-lo com conhecimento. E é muito, muito importante que isto seja cada vez mais uma percepção enquanto comunidade. Simultaneamente, nós consideramos que é importante a implementação de estratégias que preconizem um caráter diferenciador para o conhecimento gerado, voltado para a inovação e para a dinamização da economia. É muito importante que criemos condições necessárias à atração e fixação de talentos, quer no setor público, quer no setor privado, em todas as regiões do país, mas sobretudo no interior, onde a baixa densidade populacional se torna uma preocupação de todos. Nós acreditamos que é a ciência que permitirá reverter esta tendência de envelhecimento da população e de abandono destes territórios. Parece estranho alguém estar a dizer que o problema do interior não é a agricultura, não é a floresta, como tradicionalmente se diz, mas dizer que a resolução dos problemas do interior é a ciência, e estamos convictos disso. É a ciência nos setores tradicionais, mas também é a ciência em setores de ponta. Portanto, não há territórios condenados à falência, não há territórios condenados à morte e a única garantia que podemos ter de que não estão condenados é com ciência, é com conhecimento, é com talentos, é com pessoas qualificadas. E, portanto, o Ministério da Coesão Territorial tem isto bem claro e é por isso que qualquer medida que trabalhamos, ou quase todas as medidas que trabalhamos, são de braço dado com o Ministério da Ciência, como não podia deixar de ser. E quero aqui aproveitar para dizer que, quer neste quadro comunitário, quer no próximo quadro comunitário, haverá uma prioridade clara no apoio à ciência nos programas operacionais regionais. Haverá uma prioridade clara ao apoio às parcerias entre a academia, entre os centros de valorização do conhecimento, entre os centros tecnológicos e a comunidade envolvente. Sejam projetos empresariais, sejam projetos sociais, sejam projetos na área da cultura, é muito importante para nós e será uma prioridade naquilo que será o primeiro eixo dos programas operacionais, o apoio à ciência. E aqui, a este propósito, eu queria sublinhar uma experiência muito interessante, que são os laboratórios colaborativos, que basicamente institucionalizaram aquele casamento que queremos fazer, que é entre o conhecimento e a comunidade. E, portanto, estes laboratórios colaborativos transformaram práticas pontuais de investigação em copromoção, em missões organizadas segundo estratégias complementares de elevado impacto na economia do país, permitindo percorrer diferentes cadeias de valor e mobilizar a cooperação intersetorial. Portanto, temos apoiado, vamos continuar a apoiar. Não pode, num país que se quer desenvolvido, tem que ser uma das prioridades de aplicação dos fundos, estou a falar dos fundos europeus regionais, geridos nas regiões, em todas as estratégias regionais, esta é uma dimensão fundamental, a investigação colaborativa com a indústria, a investigação colaborativa com as associações e empresários, assegurando transferência do conhecimento, cocriação de conhecimento, tecnologia e inovação e, portanto, apoiar quer o que são as incubadoras, quer o que são, digamos, o robustecimento dos parques de ciência e tecnologia, os clusters tecnológicos, os projetos mobilizadores, os laboratórios colaborativos, a promoção de spin-offs, de startups, a promoção de núcleos de ID colaborativos, vão continuar a ser a prioridade na aplicação de fundos europeus. Creio que, paralelamente a esse posicionamento global e internacional que cada vez mais a nossa ciência tem, e nós temos que ter a capacidade também de nos organizarmos internamente para nos posicionarmos de forma mais competitiva nas missões definidas pela União Europeia como prioritárias. E, portanto, queria aqui dizer que devemos valorizar a capacidade de exploração, que este conhecimento tenha a capacidade e quando trabalham com as empresas, tenha a capacidade, como aqui foi referido, trabalhar o problema, trabalhar a especificidade, que este conhecimento que produzem, que este conhecimento e a tecnologia que desenvolvem tenha a capacidade de explorar as especificidades locais como elementos centrais do desenvolvimento socioeconómico do país e fazer o mesmo exercício para Portugal em relação à Europa. Estou aqui num exercício de global e de local e na importância de quando também, como atores ativos do desenvolvimento sustentável dos territórios e dos territórios mais frágeis, que tenham em conta também as especificidades desses territórios. Assumimos como sendo particularmente vital para as regiões do interior a exploração de segmentos de mercado mais sofisticados e as crescentes tendências de valorização da origem e autenticidade dos produtos. É este trabalho que está a ser feito em vários centros de investigação por todo o país, em perfeita harmonia com os institutos politécnicos, com as universidades que os acolhem e com as regiões envolventes. Queria aqui dizer que a melhoria das infraestruturas, bem como o aumento do nível tecnológico dos equipamentos, são evidentes e temos que continuar a fazer esse esforço, porém, volto ao ponto inicial, a prossecução do crescimento científico em Portugal está diretamente dependente das políticas que valorizam e consolidam a massa crítica que é o talento. E, portanto, queria aqui sublinhar a importância das medidas e do emprego científico e qualificado, alicerçando a formação doutoral, que é essencial para todas as regiões, sendo estas dinamizadas também pelas suas instituições de ensino superior, sejam elas politécnicas ou universitárias. E terminando, deixo o repto de que é com a ciência que nós, de facto, transformamos os nossos problemas em soluções que depois criam riqueza e valor e retêm os talentos nos territórios, é juntando inovação à investigação e articulando-a com o ensino que contribuímos para o desenvolvimento local, contribuindo certamente muito mais para o desenvolvimento do país. Portanto, fica aqui a palavra de mote: colaborar para inovar. Sem as empresas, o conhecimento que produzem não se transforma em inovação, não chega ao mercado, não cria valor, nem riqueza, nem que seja de forma, como dizia o nosso primeiro orador, de forma interessada, própria, mas de facto deixava aqui esta nota de grande satisfação no percurso que as nossas instituições têm feito no território. No território, deixava aqui uma nota especial para as instituições que trabalham connosco, nem de propósito, professora Helena, a Fundação para a Ciência e a Tecnologia, parceiros imprescindíveis do Ministério da Coesão e Territorial, e deixava aqui também uma palavra preciosa para o trabalho da Agência Nacional de Inovação, que têm sido parceiros das nossas CCDRs, das nossas regiões, e deixar mais uma vez sublinhado que não será certamente por falta de recursos nos fundos europeus que ainda temos para aproveitar do Portugal 2020, do Portugal 2030 e do Plano de Recuperação e Resiliência, relativamente ao qual apelamos a uma grande dinâmica dos territórios. Nós acreditamos que uma parte importante daquelas verbas tem que ser concorrencial e, portanto, obterão tanto mais verbas quanto melhores forem as propostas que apresentarem. Contem connosco para também mobilizarem os atores da região, porque é destas parcerias que certamente surgirão propostas de valor que terão mérito reconhecido, porque não esqueçamos que o objetivo final do Plano de Recuperação e Resiliência é introduzir mudanças estruturais nos territórios, envolvendo os atores dos territórios, mas isso não se faz sem ciência, isso não se faz sem conhecimento, sem tecnologia, isso não se faz sem talento. Sr. Ministro, agradeço mais uma vez todo o privilégio que tenho de trabalhar consigo e com a sua equipa e a honra de estar aqui hoje a encerrar esta sessão. A todos, parabéns pelo trabalho que têm feito e continuação de bom trabalho. Muito obrigada.